The howling wind drove shards of ice across the plains as Hank Reeves squinted through the blinding snow, a lone figure emerging from the white fury ahead. He drew his horse to a halt, disbelieving his eyes when he made out the form of a woman stumbling forward, her face raw with cold and something worse, a desperation that struck him to his core. Montana Territory, 1879. Winter had come early and with a vengeance to the untamed lands west of the Mississippi. Hank had been tracking strays from his small ranch when the blizzard descended without warning. A seasoned cowboy of 33 years, he knew better than to be caught in such conditions, but fate had other plans that bitter November afternoon. "Madam," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the gale. The woman's head snapped up, revealing tears frozen on her cheeks. Her clothes, wholly unsuited for the brutality of a Montana winter, were soaked through. "You'll die out here. Take my hand." She staggered toward him, her eyes wild with fear. "My son," she gasped as Hank reached down from his saddle. "They took my boy." "Please, we need shelter first," Hank shouted over the wind's howl. With strength born of desperation, he hauled her onto his horse. Her body trembled violently against his back as he turned the animal toward his cabin. "Hold tight to me, madam. I'll get you warm, then we'll talk about your boy." The woman's arms encircled his waist, her grip surprisingly strong despite her condition. "Catherine," she managed through chattering teeth. "My name is Catherine Winters, Hank Reeves," he replied, leaning into the wind. "My place is just beyond that ridge. We'll make it." Catherine pressed her face against his back, seeking any warmth she could find. "I can't lose him," she whispered. "He's all I have." Hank felt something stir inside him, something that had lain dormant since he'd buried his wife and infant daughter 5 years before. "We'll find him," he promised, though he had no right to make such a vow to this stranger. "Just stay with me now." The journey to Hank's cabin seemed endless. By the time they arrived, Catherine was barely conscious, her breathing shallow. Hank dismounted quickly, lifting her from the saddle with ease. He kicked open the door to his modest home and carried her inside, laying her gently on his bed. The cabin was cold, the fire having died hours before. Hank worked quickly, building a blaze in the stone hearth while casting worried glances at the woman. Once flames licked hungrily at the dry wood, he returned to Catherine's side. "Madam, Catherine," he called, patting her cheek. Her skin was alarmingly cold. "I need to get you out of these wet clothes." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused but determined. "My son," she repeated. "First we need to warm you," Hank insisted, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll step outside while you change into these." He pulled a flannel shirt and trousers from his trunk, placing them beside her. "They'll be too big, but they're dry," Catherine nodded weakly, and Hank retreated outside to tend to his horse. The blizzard showed no signs of abating. If a child was truly out there somewhere, the chances of survival dwindled with each passing minute. Hank's jaw tightened as he led his horse to the small barn attached to his cabin. He wouldn't tell Catherine that, not yet. When he returned, she was sitting by the fire, drowning in his clothes, her dark hair hanging in damp waves down her back. She'd regained some color in her cheeks, but her eyes remained haunted. "Thank you," she said softly as Hank hung her wet garments near the fire to dry. "You're welcome." He moved to the stove, stoking it before placing a pot of coffee on to boil. "Now tell me about your boy," Catherine's hands twisted in her lap. "His name is James. He's 6 years old." Her voice cracked. "We were traveling on the stagecoach from Helena. There was an attack, men in masks. They took the strongbox, but then they saw James." She drew a shuddering breath. "One of them said a boy like that would fetch a good price from certain families looking to adopt." Hank's blood ran cold. Child stealing wasn't uncommon in the territories, where orphan children could be taken in by families looking for free labor or worse. "The stage driver was killed," Catherine continued. "I tried to fight them, but one hit me with his pistol." She touched a bruise at her temple that Hank hadn't noticed before. "When I came to, they were gone. I've been tracking them for 2 days. In this," Hank gestured toward the window where snow piled against the glass. "I couldn't wait," she said simply. "He's my son." Hank nodded, understanding a parent's desperation all too well. How many men? 3. Catherine accepted the cup of coffee he offered. They were headed northwest toward the mountains. At least, that's what I gathered before the storm hit and I lost their trail. Hank considered this information. Northwest meant they might be heading for one of the mining camps tucked into the foothills, lawless places where few questions were asked. Or perhaps they had a cabin hidden in the wilderness, a place to lie low until they could transport the boy elsewhere. We can't go after them tonight, he said, moving to his small pantry to prepare a simple meal. But I know these mountains better than most. At first light, if the storm's broken, we'll set out. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. He must be so scared. Hank set a bowl of beans and salt pork before her. Eat, you'll need your strength. He sat across from her with his own portion. Tell me about your son. What does he look like? As they ate, Catherine described James a small boy with her dark hair and his father's blue eyes, a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon behind his right ear. She spoke of his gentle nature, his love of stories, how he'd talk to any animal that crossed his path. With each detail, Hank felt his resolve strengthening. This wasn't just about a woman in distress, this was about a child who needed saving. Where's his father? Hank asked finally, the question that had been nagging at him. Catherine's face hardened slightly. Dead. Typhoid took him last spring in St. Louis. James and I were starting fresh in Montana. I have a sister in Fort Benton. Night deepened around the cabin as the storm raged on. Hank insisted Catherine take his bed while he made do with a bedroll near the fire. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind and thinking about the woman asleep across the room, her courage, her determination, her love for her son that drove her into a blizzard with nothing but hope. Morning brought an eerie stillness. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine white landscape under a clear blue sky. Hank rose before dawn, preparing supplies for their journey. By the time Catherine awoke, he had saddled 2 horses, his own sturdy gelding, and a more docile mare he kept for packhorse duties. You know how to ride? He asked as Catherine emerged from the cabin, back in her now dry clothes. Well enough, she replied, her face set with determination. I grew up on a farm in Missouri. Hank nodded approvingly. Good, we'll make better time on horseback. He handed her a wool coat and a pair of gloves. These belong to my wife. They should fit you better than mine would. Catherine accepted the items without comment, but her eyes asked the question her lips did not. She died, Hank said simply. Childbed fever, her and our daughter both. I'm sorry, Catherine replied softly, slipping on the coat. Hank busied himself with checking the saddle straps. It was a long time ago. They set out as the sun crested the eastern mountains. The fresh snow made tracking difficult, but Hank had spent enough years in these parts to recognize the subtle signs of human passage, a broken branch here, a depression in the snow there. They rode northwest, following Catherine's memory of the direction her son's abductors had taken. You're not from around here, Catherine observed as they navigated a narrow pass between snow-laden pines. Hank shook his head. Texas originally, came up with a cattle drive 10 years back and stayed, like the space, the quiet. It's beautiful, Catherine admitted, looking around at the snow-covered mountains. Under different circumstances, I might appreciate it more. They rode in companionable silence for several hours, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of jerky and hardtack. By mid-afternoon, Hank spotted smoke rising from a distant valley. There's a cabin down there, he said, pointing. Could be hunters, trappers, or our thieves. Catherine's face tightened with hope and fear. How do we approach? Carefully, Hank replied, reaching for the rifle strapped to his saddle. We'll leave the horses here and go on foot, get a look at who's down there before we make our move. They secured the animals in a sheltered copse and proceeded on foot through the deep snow. Hank moved with surprising stealth for a man of his size, and Catherine followed in his footsteps, her breath clouding before her. The cabin was small and crude, clearly a hunting lodge rather than a permanent residence. From their vantage point behind a fallen log, Hank could see 2 horses and a mule tethered outside. Only 2 animals, he whispered. Catherine, are you certain there were 3 men? Positive, she replied, her eyes never leaving the cabin. Hank frowned. Then either they split up or the cabin door swung open and a burly man stepped out, stretching in the cold air. He wore a heavy coat and a beard that covered most of his face, but even at this distance, Hank could see the pistol strapped to his hip. "That's one of them," Catherine hissed, her body tensing. "The one who hit me." Hank placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Wait, we need to see who else is in there before we make a move." They didn't have to wait long. A second man emerged, this one leaner and younger, carrying an armful of firewood. The two exchanged words that didn't carry to where Hank and Catherine hid. "Where's James?" Catherine whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "And the third man?" As if in answer to her question, a small figure appeared in the doorway, a boy with dark hair, bundled in a coat too large for his slight frame. Even from a distance, Hank could see the resemblance to Catherine. "James," she breathed, half rising before Hank pulled her back down. "Easy," he cautioned. "We're outnumbered and outgunned. We need a plan." Catherine turned to him, her eyes fierce. "I'm getting my son back, with or without a plan." Hank studied her face, recognizing the same determination he'd seen in his own wife years ago. "I know you are," he said softly. "But let's do it right. For James's sake." They watched as the boy was allowed to play in the snow under the watchful eye of the younger kidnapper while the bearded man returned inside. James built a small snowman, his movements lacking the usual exuberance of a child at play. Even from their hiding place, Hank could see the boy was frightened but trying to behave. "He's smart," Hank observed. "Not causing trouble, biding his time." Catherine nodded, pride momentarily overwhelming her fear. "He's always been clever." Hank considered their options. A direct confrontation was risky with the boy so close. If bullets started flying, he shook his head, unwilling to consider that outcome. "I have an idea," he said finally. "But it means waiting until nightfall." Catherine looked stricken. "That's hours away." "I know." Hank's voice was gentle but firm, "but it gives us the best chance of getting him out safely." Reluctantly, Catherine agreed. They retreated to where they'd left the horses, and Hank outlined his plan. As the afternoon waned, they prepared, Catherine's hand steady despite the fear in her eyes. Darkness fell early in the mountain valley. Hank and Catherine approached the cabin from different directions, she from the rear, he from the side nearest the tethered animals. The plan was simple. Hank would create a distraction by setting the nearby woodpile ablaze, drawing the men outside. Catherine would slip in and get James while Hank kept the kidnappers occupied. The night was painfully cold, the stars brilliant in the black sky as Hank struck a match and touched it to the kindling he'd prepared at the base of the woodpile. The dry wood caught quickly, flames licking upward. "Fire!" Hank shouted, moving swiftly to untie the horses and mule, slapping their rumps to send them running. "Your animals are loose." The cabin door burst open, both men rushing out with curses on their lips. They saw the flames first, then their fleeing mounts. The horses. The younger one yelled, taking off after them. The bearded man hesitated, looking between the fire and the retreating animals. "The boy," he growled, turning back toward the cabin. Hank stepped from the shadows, rifle raised. "I wouldn't," he said calmly. The man's hand dropped to his gun, but Hank was faster. A single shot rang out and the kidnapper fell with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. Inside the cabin, Catherine had found James huddled on a rough pallet in the corner. His eyes widened in disbelief when he saw her. "Mama," he whispered, as if afraid he was dreaming. "I'm here, my brave boy," Catherine choked, gathering him into her arms. "I've come to take you home." Outside, Hank had disarmed the wounded man and was keeping watch for the younger kidnapper's return. "Catherine," he called, "you have him?" "Yes." She replied, emerging with James clutched tightly to her side. "Then let's go," Hank said, backing toward the trees while keeping his rifle trained on the bearded man. "His friend will be back soon." They fled into the darkness, James riding with his mother on the docile mare while Hank led the way back toward his cabin. The boy was quiet, still stunned by the sudden turn of events, but his small arms remained locked around Catherine's waist. "Where's the third man?" Hank asked once they'd put several miles between themselves and the hunting cabin. "They said he went to sell the strongbox contents in Billings." James piped up, his voice small but steady. He took my boots so I couldn't run away. Hank glanced back, noticing for the first time that the boy wore only woolen socks on his feet. A surge of anger rose in his chest, quickly tempered by relief that the child seemed otherwise unharmed. "Are you hurt anywhere?" Catherine asked, twisting in the saddle to examine her son in the moonlight. James shook his head. "They said I had to be quiet and do what they said or they'd hurt you." His voice wobbled. "I didn't know if you were okay, Mama." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Catherine assured him, though Hank noticed she touched the bruise on her temple self-consciously. "And you were so brave." They reached Hank's cabin well after midnight, all three exhausted but too keyed up to sleep. Hank built up the fire while Catherine settled James on the bed, removing his damp socks and wrapping his feet in a warm blanket. "Are you hungry?" Hank asked the boy, who nodded shyly. "I think I can rustle up some flapjacks, even at this hour." As Hank prepared the simple meal, he watched mother and son reunited. Catherine couldn't seem to stop touching James, smoothing his hair, checking his hands and face, pressing kisses to his forehead. The boy leaned into her touches, clearly drawing strength from her presence. They ate together at Hank's small table, James devouring 3 flapjacks drizzled with the last of Hank's molasses while Catherine picked at her portion, too emotional to have much appetite. "What happens now?" James asked suddenly, looking between his mother and the tall cowboy who had helped rescue him. Catherine and Hank exchanged a glance. "Now we rest," Catherine said, "and tomorrow we'll continue to Aunt Harriet's in Fort Benton." James nodded, accepting this answer. "Will Mr. Hank come with us?" The question hung in the air, innocent yet loaded with implication. Hank cleared his throat. "I reckon you and your ma will be safe enough on the stage once we reach town. But those men," James persisted, his blue eyes serious, "what if they come looking for us?" "James," Catherine began, but Hank interrupted gently. "That's a fair question," he said. "The man I shot won't be traveling anytime soon, and his friend will have his hands full trying to round up those horses in the dark. As for the third man..." He considered his next words carefully. "We should report what happened to the marshal in town. They robbed a stagecoach and kidnapped a child. That's enough to get a posse organized." Catherine nodded, though Hank could see the worry still etched in her features. "We'll leave at first light," she decided. James fell asleep soon after, curled against his mother on Hank's bed. Hank insisted they take it while he again made do with his bedroll by the fire. As he stared into the dying embers, he found himself thinking about Fort Benton, about Catherine and James continuing their journey without him. The thought left a hollow feeling in his chest that he couldn't quite explain. "Hank," Catherine's whisper came from across the darkened room. "Are you awake?" "Yes, madam," he replied, sitting up. She appeared beside him, kneeling on the rough plank floor. In the faint glow from the fireplace, her face was both beautiful and vulnerable. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," Hank said, suddenly acutely aware of her proximity. "Any decent man would have done the same." Catherine shook her head. "Most men would have given me directions to the nearest town and ridden on. You took in a stranger, risked your life." Her voice caught. "You gave me back my son." Before Hank could respond, she leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered again, then returned to her sleeping child. Hank remained motionless, his hand rising unconsciously to touch the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. It had been so long since he'd felt a woman's touch, even one as innocent as this. Something stirred within him, a feeling he'd thought long buried with his wife and daughter. Morning came all too quickly. They ate a hasty breakfast, and Hank saddled the horses while Catherine helped James bundle up against the cold. The boy had taken an immediate liking to Hank, peppering him with questions about ranch life and the various animals Hank kept. "You have any children, Mr. Hank?" James asked as they prepared to depart. A shadow crossed Hank's face. "I had a little girl once," he said quietly. "But she and her mama went to heaven a long time ago." James considered this with the solemnity only a child can muster. "That's sad. My pa went to heaven too." He looked up at the tall cowboy. "Maybe they know each other up there." Hank's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Maybe they do, son." The ride to town was uneventful, the day clear and cold. James rode with Hank, his small body tucked securely against the cowboy's chest. Catherine followed on the mare, watching the easy way her son had taken to this quiet, strong man who had come into their lives so unexpectedly. In town, Hank took them directly to the marshal's office. Marshal Sullivan, a grizzled veteran of the frontier, listened to their story with growing concern. "Stagecoach robbery's serious enough," he said, making notes in his logbook. "Child stealing's even worse. I'll send a telegram to Billings about that third fellow." He looked at Catherine. "You say you're bound for Fort Benton, madam?" "Yes," Catherine confirmed. "My sister lives there." The marshal nodded. "Next stage isn't due through until day after tomorrow. Hotel's just down the street clean enough, though the food's nothing to write home about." "Thank you, Marshal," Catherine replied, rising to leave outside. An awkward silence fell between her and Hank. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, hat in hand. "Well," he said finally, "I reckon this is where we part ways." Catherine felt an unexpected pang at his words. "Yes, I suppose it is." James looked up at them both, his brow furrowed. "But Mama, can't Mr. Hank come to Aunt Harriet's too?" "Mr. Hank has his own home to get back to," Catherine explained gently. "His ranch needs tending." The boy's face fell. "Oh," Hank knelt down to James's level. "You take care of your mama, you hear? She's a mighty brave woman." James nodded solemnly. "I will." Then, with the impulsiveness of childhood, he threw his arms around Hank's neck in a fierce hug. Hank stiffened momentarily before returning the embrace, his large hand cradling the back of the boy's head. Over James's shoulder, his eyes met Catherine's, and something unspoken passed between them. "The hotel, then," Hank said as he stood, clearing his throat. "Let me help you get settled." They secured a room for Catherine and James, and Hank carried their few belongings upstairs. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. "It's perfect," Catherine said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Hank lingered in the doorway. "I should get back to my place." "Animals need tending, of course." Catherine tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Hank, could we have dinner together?" James interrupted, looking hopefully between the adults. "Before you go," Catherine and Hank exchanged glances. "I don't see why not," Hank replied, unable to refuse the boy. The dining room downstairs in an hour, dinner was a strangely domestic affair. James chattered happily, seemingly recovered from his ordeal, while Catherine and Hank contributed to the conversation when required, but mostly watched the boy with shared affection. "He's resilient," Hank observed quietly when James became absorbed in the apple pie the hotel cook had provided for dessert. Catherine nodded. "Children often are, more so than adults, I think." Hank considered this. "Maybe it's because they haven't learned to dwell on what might have been." Their eyes met across the table, and Catherine felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the rich food. There was something about this man, his quiet strength, his kindness, the way he looked at her son as if James were something precious. After dinner, Hank walked them back to their room. James was drooping with exhaustion, his earlier energy spent. "Good night, Mr. Hank," he mumbled as Catherine guided him through the door. "Good night, James," Hank replied softly. "Sleep well." Catherine hesitated in the doorway. "Will we see you before we leave?" Hank shifted uncomfortably. "I should head back at first light. Ranch won't run itself." Disappointment flashed across Catherine's face before she could mask it. "Of course. Then I suppose this is goodbye," Hank nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Take care of yourself, Catherine, and that fine boy of yours." "We will," she extended her hand. "Thank you again for everything." Hank took her hand, but instead of shaking it, he simply held it for a moment, his calloused thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Safe travels," he said finally, releasing her and turning to go. Catherine watched him walk away, a strange emptiness settling in her chest. It made no sense to feel this way about a man she'd known for barely 2 days. Yet as she closed the door and turned to help James prepare for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping away from her. Hank spent the night at the livery stable, his bedroll spread in an empty stall. Sleep eluded him as his mind replayed the events of the past days. Catherine's face kept appearing in his thoughts, her determination, her fierce love for her son, the softness of her lips against his cheek. And James, with his serious questions and impulsive hug, had awakened feelings Hank had thought long dead. But what was he thinking? They were heading to Fort Benton, to family and a new life. He had a ranch to run, livestock to tend. Their paths had crossed briefly, nothing more. Dawn found him already saddled and ready to depart. He led his horse down the main street, passing the hotel with a mixture of relief and regret that it was too early for Catherine and James to be about. He was nearly at the edge of town when he heard his name called. Turning, he saw James running toward him, still in his nightshirt with a blanket clutched around his shoulders. "Mr. Hank," the boy cried, his bare feet slapping against the cold ground. "Wait," Hank dismounted quickly, catching James as the boy flung himself forward. "What are you doing out here without your boots, son?" he asked, wrapping his coat around the shivering child. "I saw you from the window," James panted. "You can't go yet, James." Catherine appeared, hair disheveled, hastily dressed in yesterday's clothes. "James, you can't just run off like that." "But Mama," the boy protested. Mr. Hank was leaving without saying goodbye. Catherine reached them, out of breath and clearly upset. "I'm so sorry," she began, but Hank shook his head. "No harm done," he said, though he frowned at James's bare feet. "Let's get him back inside before he catches his death." They returned to the hotel, where Catherine bustled James back to their room to dress properly. Hank waited awkwardly in the small lobby, hat in hand, aware of the curious glances from the desk clerk. When Catherine and James reappeared, the boy was fully dressed and considerably calmer. "I'm sorry I ran out like that," he said with the gravity of a child trying very hard to be grown up, "but I had to ask you something important." Hank knelt down to James's level. "What's that, son?" James took a deep breath. "Would you come with us to Fort Benton, please?" Hank's eyes flew to Catherine's face. She looked as surprised as he felt. "James, we talked about this," she began gently. "Mr. Hank has his own home to get back to." "But he could visit," James persisted. "Couldn't you, Mr. Hank, just for a little while?" Hank found himself caught between the hopeful face of the boy and the unreadable expression of his mother. "I don't know, James," he said honestly. "Fort Benton's a fair piece from my ranch." "But those men might still be looking for us," James said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'd feel safer if you were there." Hank looked to Catherine, seeking guidance. She seemed torn, her eyes reflecting confusion and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Perhaps." She said slowly, "Perhaps Mr. Hank could accompany us to Fort Benton, just until we're settled." She met Hank's gaze directly. "If he's willing, that is." The request hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to voice. Hank thought of his empty cabin, the long winter nights ahead. He thought of Catherine's kiss on his cheek and James's trusting embrace. "I could do that," he heard himself say. "Make sure you get there safely." James's face lit up with delight. "Really, you'll come?" "Really," Hank confirmed, a smile tugging at his lips despite his better judgment. "But I'll need to stop by my place first to secure things for a longer absence." Catherine's relief was palpable. "We'll wait for the stage together then." The next day and a half passed in a comfortable rhythm that surprised them all. Hank rode out to his ranch and back, bringing supplies and making arrangements with a neighboring rancher to check on his livestock. In town, they explored the small shops together, Catherine purchasing new boots for James and warm clothes for them both for the journey ahead. The stagecoach arrived late on the second day, delayed by road conditions further south. As they boarded for the final leg of their journey to Fort Benton, Hank found himself watching Catherine, the grace with which she moved, the gentle firmness she showed with James, the rare but dazzling smile that transformed her face when something amused her. The coach was crowded with 5 passengers in addition to themselves, a drummer selling patent medicines, an elderly couple returning from visiting relatives in Helena, and a young woman traveling to take up a position as a schoolteacher in Fort Benton. "Is that where you're headed to?" The young woman, Miss Abigail Porter, asked Catherine. "Yes," Catherine replied. "My sister lives there. I'm going to help with her millinery shop." "How lovely," Miss Porter exclaimed. "I've always admired ladies who work with their hands. Is this your husband?" She nodded toward Hank, who sat across from them with James at his side. Catherine flushed. "No, Mr. Reeves is a friend who's kindly accompanying us." "I see," Miss Porter replied, though her tone suggested she saw rather more than Catherine had intended to reveal. The journey to Fort Benton took 2 days, with an overnight stop at a way station where they slept in crude bunks and ate a hearty if uninspired meal of beans and bacon. Throughout the trip, James remained glued to Hank's side, peppering him with questions about ranch life and listening with rapt attention to Hank's stories of cattle drives and breaking wild horses. Catherine watched their interaction with mixed emotions. It was clear her son was forming an attachment to Hank, an attachment that would only lead to heartbreak when Hank inevitably returned to his ranch. Yet she couldn't bring herself to discourage it, not when she saw how Hank's normally reserved face softened when James spoke to him. Fort Benton appeared on the horizon late on the second day, a sprawling town on the banks of the Missouri River. Once the furthest point accessible by steamboat, it had been a vital hub for fur traders and gold seekers. Though its heyday had passed with the advent of the railroad further south, it remained an important trading center for the territory. "Is that it, Mama?" James asked, pressing his face against the coach window. "That's it," Catherine confirmed. "Your Aunt Harriet lives near the river, not far from her shop." As the stagecoach rolled into town, Catherine felt a curious mixture of relief and apprehension. They had made it safely, despite everything. Yet now the moment approached when she would have to say goodbye to the man who had saved them both. Harriet Winters was waiting at the stage stop, a tall woman with the same dark hair as Catherine but a more angular face. She rushed forward as they disembarked, sweeping James into a hug before embracing her sister. "I've been sick with worry since I got your telegram," she exclaimed. "Robbed and kidnapped, it's too terrible to contemplate." "We're fine now," Catherine assured her, turning to introduce Hank. "This is Mr. Hank Reeves. He's the reason we're here safely." Harriet assessed Hank with open curiosity. "Then I owe you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Reeves." "No debt, madam," Hank replied, tipping his hat. "Just glad I could help." "Mr. Hank saved me from the bad men," James declared proudly. "He shot one of them?" Harriet's eyebrows rose. "Did he indeed? Well, you must join us for dinner and tell me all about it." Hank hesitated, looking uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "That's kind of you, madam, but I should find lodgings for the night." "Nonsense," Harriet waved his objection away. "I have plenty of room. I insist you stay with us, at least until you've rested from your journey." Catherine caught Hank's eye, offering a small smile of encouragement. "Please, it's the least we can do." Unable to refuse gracefully, Hank found himself accompanying them to Harriet's home, a comfortable 2-story house near the riverfront. Inside, it was feminine but not fussy, reflecting its owner's practical nature. "You'll stay in the guest room upstairs," Harriet informed Hank. "James, you'll bunk with your cousin Thomas when he returns from school." She turned to Catherine. "I've prepared the blue room for you, just as you requested in your letter." Dinner was a lively affair, with Harriet's son Thomas joining them, a boy a year older than James who regarded his cousin with the wary interest of a child meeting potential competition. As the meal progressed, however, the boys found common ground in their shared love of adventure stories and Wild West tales. "Mr. Hank has a real ranch," James informed Thomas importantly, "with horses and cattle and everything." Thomas looked suitably impressed. "Have you ever shot an Indian, Mr. Hank?" he asked with boyish bloodthirstiness. "Thomas," Harriet scolded. "What a thing to ask." "It's all right," Hank said mildly. "No, son, I haven't. Most Indians I've known have been peaceful folk, just trying to live their lives same as us." "But what about the Sioux and Custer's last stand?" Thomas persisted. "That was different times," Hank replied, "and there's usually more to those stories than makes it into the newspapers." He glanced at Catherine. "Most conflicts come from fear and misunderstanding, not genuine meanness." The evening passed pleasantly, with Harriet proving to be an engaging hostess despite her initially intimidating manner. After the boys were sent to bed, the adults sat in the parlor with cups of coffee. "So, Mr. Reeves," Harriet began, fixing Hank with a direct gaze. Catherine tells me you have a ranch near Helena, southwest of there, Hank confirmed. Nothing fancy, but it's mine, free and clear. And what brought you to Montana originally? She asked, her tone casual but her eyes shrewd. Hank seemed to recognize the questioning for what it was, a sister's protective instinct. Came up with a cattle drive from Texas 10 years back, he answered honestly. Worked as a trail boss for a few years, saved my money, then bought my spread when the previous owner decided to head to California. I see. Harriet nodded thoughtfully. And you live there alone, Harriet, Catherine interjected. Mr. Reeves doesn't need to account for his personal arrangements. It's all right, Hank assured her. Yes, madam, I live alone. Had a wife and daughter once, but lost them both to childbed fever 5 years back. Harriet's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss. Hank acknowledged this with a slight nod, then rose. If you'll excuse me, it's been a long journey. I think I'll turn in. After he'd gone upstairs, Harriet turned to her sister with raised eyebrows. Well, he's certainly not what I expected. What do you mean? Catherine asked, though she had a feeling she knew. When your telegram said a cowboy had rescued you, I imagined some rough, uncouth character. Harriet smiled. Mr. Reeves is quite civilized. Catherine found herself defensive on Hank's behalf. He's a good man. We owe him everything. Yes, I can see that. Harriet studied her sister's face, and James seems quite attached to him already. James lost his father, Catherine reminded her. It's natural he'd respond to a kind male figure. And what about you? Harriet asked softly. How do you respond to him? Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm grateful to him, of course. Is that all? Harriet pressed. Harriet, please. Catherine stood, suddenly unable to meet her sister's knowing gaze. We've known each other for less than a week. Sometimes that's all it takes, Harriet observed. Robert and I knew after 2 days. Catherine had no answer for that. Her late brother-in-law had been devoted to Harriet from the moment they met until his death from a logging accident 3 years earlier. He'll be returning to his ranch soon, Catherine said finally. This. Whatever it might be, it doesn't matter. Harriet rose and embraced her sister. Everything matters, Catherine, especially the things we try to convince ourselves don't. Morning brought a clear, cold day. Hank rose early, as was his habit, and found Catherine already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. You're up with the chickens, she observed with a smile. Ranch habits, he replied, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. Hard to break. They worked together in comfortable silence, Hank slicing bread while Catherine tended to the eggs and bacon. It felt strangely natural, as if they'd done this many times before. Your sister has a nice home, Hank said eventually. Yes, Catherine nodded. She's done well for herself. The millinery shop is quite successful, and you'll be working there with her. That's the plan. Catherine turned from the stove to face him. Hank, I've been thinking about your return journey. Hank's hands stilled on the bread knife. Oh, the weather's turning. Winter comes early up here. She hesitated. Perhaps you should wait until spring. Hank's eyebrows rose. That's months away, I know. Catherine looked down at her hands. But the mountain passes can be treacherous, and the stage fare would be expensive for a return trip so soon. Hank studied her face, trying to read what lay beneath her practical concerns. Are you asking me to stay, Catherine? Before she could answer, footsteps thundered down the stairs and James burst into the kitchen, followed more sedately by Thomas. Mr. Hank, James exclaimed. Thomas says there's ice on the river already. Can we go see? The moment between Catherine and Hank dissolved, but the question lingered in the air, unanswered. After breakfast, Harriet announced her intention to show Catherine the millinery shop. You boys can show Mr. Reeves around town, she suggested to Thomas and James. Just be back for lunch. The tour of Fort Benton proved educational for all concerned. Thomas, proud of his local knowledge, led them to the river landing where steamboats still occasionally docked, the mercantile where furs and goods were traded, and finally to the fort itself, now mostly serving as the town's administrative center. And that's the jail, Thomas pointed out importantly. That's where they keep the really bad men. James looked up at Hank. Like the men who took me, Hank nodded gravely. Exactly like them, son. As they were returning to Harriet's house, they passed a notice board covered with wanted posters and announcements. Hank paused, scanning the weathered sheets, then suddenly stiffened. "Boys, wait here a moment," he instructed, stepping closer to examine one particular poster. The crude lithograph showed a man with sharp features and cold eyes. "Wanted, Jackson Harding," the poster read, "for stagecoach robbery, assault, kidnapping, reward $500. Below was a description that matched one of the men who had taken James, the third man, who'd gone to Billings with the stolen goods. "Thomas," Hank said carefully, "is there a telegraph office in town?" "Yes, sir," the boy replied, "by the stage office." "I need to send a wire," Hank decided. "Let's make a quick stop." At the telegraph office, Hank composed a message to Marshal Sullivan in Helena, informing him that one of the kidnappers had been identified and providing the information from the wanted poster. As he paid for the telegram, he noticed James watching him with solemn eyes. "Are you telling the marshal about the bad men?" the boy asked. "That's right," Hank confirmed. "So they can be caught and put away where they can't hurt anyone else." James nodded, satisfied with this answer, but Hank couldn't help worrying. Until all three men were behind bars, there was a chance, however remote, that they might seek revenge for their foiled plans. When they returned to the house, Hank shared his discovery with Catherine and Harriet. Catherine paled visibly at the news. "So he's known to the law already," she said quietly. "A habitual criminal. Looks that way," Hank agreed. "But the good news is he's wanted in several territories. Every lawman for 500 miles will be looking for him." Harriet frowned thoughtfully. "Still, it might be wise to keep James close to home for a while, just to be safe." Later that afternoon, a response came from Marshal Sullivan. The wounded kidnapper had been apprehended when he sought medical attention in a nearby settlement. His younger companion remained at large, but was believed to be heading east toward the Dakota Territory. As for Jackson Harding, there had been no sightings since the robbery. The telegram concluded with a request that Catherine and James remain in Fort Benton until the investigation was complete, and a suggestion that Hank might want to extend his visit to ensure their safety. "Well," Harriet said after reading the message, "it seems your decision has been made for you, Mr. Reeves." Hank looked to Catherine, whose expression was a mixture of relief and something more complex. "Would that be agreeable to you?" he asked. "My staying on a while longer?" "Yes," she replied simply. "Very agreeable." Days stretched into weeks as November deepened toward December. Hank found himself settling into life in Fort Benton with surprising ease. He took odd jobs around town, helping at the livery stable, assisting with repairs at the mercantile, even joining a short cattle drive to a nearby ranch. The work kept him busy and provided enough income to pay Harriet for his room and board, despite her protests that it wasn't necessary. James thrived with his cousin and the other children in town, though he still sought out Hank's company whenever possible. The boy's nightmares, frequent in the days immediately following his rescue, gradually subsided. Catherine attributed this to the security of having both her and Hank nearby, a thought that filled Hank with quiet pride. For her part, Catherine quickly proved herself invaluable at the millinery shop. Her deft fingers and eye for color transformed simple hats into fashionable creations that drew customers from as far away as the neighboring settlements. Watching her work one afternoon when he'd stopped by the shop, Hank was struck by her concentration, the slight furrow between her brows as she pinned a ribbon just so. "You're staring, Mr. Reeves," Harriet commented from behind the counter where she was tallying the day's receipts. Hank ducked his head, embarrassed to be caught. "Just admiring the craftsmanship," he muttered. "Indeed." Harriet's tone was dry but not unkind. "Catherine has always had a gift for making beautiful things." As December arrived, Fort Benton prepared for Christmas. Evergreen boughs appeared in shop windows, and the church began rehearsals for the Christmas pageant. James was selected to play a shepherd, a role he took very seriously, practicing his 2 lines with Hank each evening. "You think my pa can see me from heaven?" he asked one night as Hank tucked him into bed. "When I'm in the pageant," Hank sat on the edge of the bed, considering the question carefully. I believe he can, he said finally, and I think he'd be mighty proud of the brave boy you've become. James nodded, satisfied. Mama says you might go back to your ranch after Christmas. The statement caught Hank off guard. Did she now? She was telling Aunt Harriet, James explained. She said you must be missing your home. Hank studied the boy's face, noting the worry in his eyes. Would it bother you if I left? James nodded solemnly. I'd miss you something awful. A lump formed in Hank's throat. I'd miss you too, son. Then why go? James asked with a child's directness. Why indeed? Hank had been asking himself the same question with increasing frequency. His ranch seemed more distant with each passing day, while his attachment to James and to Catherine grew stronger. It's complicated, James, he said finally. Sometimes grown-ups have responsibilities that pull them in different directions. James accepted this with a yawn, his eyelids growing heavy. I wish you could stay forever, he mumbled as sleep overtook him. Hank remained beside the bed long after James had fallen asleep, pondering the boy's words. When he finally rose, he found Catherine standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable in the dim light. He loves you, she said softly as they moved into the hallway. He's a good boy, Hank replied, suddenly unsure of himself. Catherine, about what he said about my leaving after Christmas. I shouldn't have discussed it with Harriet where he could overhear, Catherine interrupted. I'm sorry. Is that what you want? Hank asked, his voice low. For me to leave? Catherine's eyes widened. No, I mean. She took a steadying breath. What I want doesn't matter. You have a life, a home to return to. And if I'm finding new reasons to stay, Hank stepped closer, close enough to see the pulse fluttering at her throat. Hank. Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. We've known each other such a short time. Time enough for me to know my own mind, he replied, and my heart. The confession hung between them, fragile and momentous. Catherine's lips parted, but whatever she might have said was lost as Harriet appeared at the top of the stairs. There you are, she said briskly. Thomas is asking for a bedtime story, Catherine. Would you mind? Catherine nodded, her eyes never leaving Hank's face. We'll talk later, she promised, then moved past him toward Thomas's room. Later never came that night. By the time Catherine had settled Thomas, Hank had retired to the guest room, the door firmly closed. She stood outside it for a long moment, hand raised to knock, before losing her nerve and retreating to her own room. The following morning brought an unexpected development. A telegram arrived for Catherine from the marshal in Helena, informing her that Jackson Harding had been apprehended in Billings attempting to sell items stolen from the stagecoach. All 3 kidnappers were now in custody, awaiting trial. It's over, Catherine breathed, reading the message aloud to Hank and Harriet in the kitchen. They can't hurt us now. That's wonderful news, Harriet exclaimed, hugging her sister. Now you and James can truly begin your new life here without looking over your shoulders. Hank nodded, genuinely relieved yet strangely deflated. With the threat removed, his presence as protector was no longer necessary. I'm glad they caught him, he said sincerely. James will rest easier knowing that. Catherine studied his face. Yes, he will, she agreed. Though I suspect other concerns will take its place. Before Hank could respond, James and Thomas burst into the kitchen, ready for breakfast and full of excitement about the upcoming Christmas pageant. The moment for private conversation was lost again. That afternoon found Hank at the livery stable, helping the aging owner shoe a particularly recalcitrant mare. The physical work helped clear his mind, though his thoughts kept returning to Catherine and the words they'd exchanged outside James's bedroom. You're mighty quiet today, Reeves, observed Bill Thornton, the livery owner. Something troubling you? Hank shrugged. Just thinking. About that pretty widow and her boy, I'd wager, Bill said shrewdly. Whole town's noticed how you look at her. Hank straightened, surprised. Is that so? Bill chuckled. Small town, son, folks notice things. He paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow despite the December chill. Take my advice, if you found something worth holding on to, don't let it slip away. It's not that simple, Hank muttered. Never is, Bill agreed. But that doesn't mean it ain't worth doing. The conversation stayed with Hank as he finished his work and headed back toward Harriet's house. As he rounded the corner onto the main street, he spotted Catherine emerging from the millinery shop, a package under her arm. She saw him at the same moment, and her face brightened in a way that made his heart skip. "Finished at the livery?" she asked as he fell into step beside her. "For today," Hank confirmed. Bill's mare finally saw reason. They walked in companionable silence for a few moments, their breath clouding in the cold air. Hank was acutely aware of Catherine's proximity, the way her shoulder occasionally brushed against his arm. "About last night," he began finally. "Yes," Catherine said, stopping to face him. "We should talk about that." Hank took a deep breath. "I meant what I said, Catherine. I've been alone a long time, convinced that part of my life was over. Then I found you in that blizzard, and everything changed." Catherine's eyes searched his face. "Hank, I can't ask you to give up your ranch, your life, for us." "You're not asking," he pointed out. "I'm offering." He took her gloved hand in his. "I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything. I care for you, Catherine, and for James." "And we care for you," she admitted softly. "More than I thought possible after losing Edward." Hank felt a surge of hope at her words. "Then let me stay, not just through Christmas, but beyond." "To do what?" Catherine asked practically. "Fort Benton already has a livery stable." "I've been thinking about that," Hank replied. "There's good grazing land outside town toward the foothills. Could start a small breeding operation, raising quality horses for the Army contracts." Catherine's eyes widened. "You've given this serious thought." "I have." Hank squeezed her hand. "I'm not proposing we rush into anything, Catherine, but I'd like the chance to court you properly, to be a part of your and James's lives." A slow smile spread across Catherine's face. "I think I'd like that very much, Hank Reeves." Before he could respond, a snowball whizzed past his ear, followed by the sound of boyish laughter. James and Thomas stood across the street, already preparing their next volley. "We're under attack," Hank observed gravely, though his eyes danced with amusement. Catherine laughed, the sound like music in the winter air. "So it would seem. Best strategy?" Hank asked, pulling her behind the shelter of a hitching post as more snowballs flew. "Divide and conquer," Catherine decided, already gathering snow in her hands. "You take Thomas, I'll handle my son." The impromptu snowball fight that followed drew amused glances from passers-by. Catherine proved surprisingly accurate with her throws, while Hank's larger snowballs provided impressive but easy-to-dodge artillery. By the time they called a truce, all four were breathless and laughing, their clothes dusted with snow. "Not fair," James protested good-naturedly. "Grown-ups against kids, all's fair in love and snowball fights," Hank replied, ruffling the boy's hair. They walked home together, the boys racing ahead while Hank and Catherine followed at a more sedate pace. Hank felt a profound contentment settle over him, a rightness he hadn't experienced in years. "Penny for your thoughts," Catherine said, noticing his expression. "Just thinking this feels like family," Hank admitted. "Something I'd given up hope of having again." Catherine slipped her arm through his. "It does, doesn't it?" The days leading up to Christmas passed in a flurry of activity. The millinery shop was busier than ever with last-minute orders, while Hank found himself recruited for everything from hanging decorations at the church to playing Santa Claus at the school Christmas party. "You're a natural with children," Catherine observed after watching him entertain a group of wide-eyed youngsters with tales of Santa's reindeer. "Never had much chance to be around them before," Hank replied. "But they're not so different from Colt's spirited, curious, needing firm but gentle handling," Catherine laughed. "I'm not sure whether to be amused or horrified that you're comparing my son to a horse." "Both fine creatures," Hank assured her with a wink. Their courtship progressed with the cautious optimism of two people who had known loss and were careful with their hearts. Harriet, after initial skepticism, became their staunchest supporter, often volunteering to watch the boys so Hank and Catherine could have time alone. "You deserve happiness," she told her sister one evening as they prepared for bed. "Both of you do." "It's happening so fast," Catherine confessed. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm being foolish." "The heart knows what it wants," Harriet replied pragmatically. "And from what I've seen," Hank Reeves is a good man who adores both you and James. Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold, stars blazing in the night sky as the townspeople gathered for the church pageant. James performed his shepherd role flawlessly, his face solemn as he delivered his lines about following the star to Bethlehem. Watching from the pew beside Catherine, Hank felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. He reached for her hand in the darkness, and she twined her fingers with his, a silent acknowledgement of their growing bond. After the pageant, they returned to Harriet's house for a festive supper of roast goose and all the trimmings. The boys were allowed to open one gift, each new hand-carved wooden soldiers from Hank, who had worked on them secretly in the evenings. "Did you make these yourself?" James asked, examining the detailed figure with awe. "Sure did," Hank confirmed. "My pa taught me whittling when I was about your age, said it kept hands busy and minds clear." "Will you teach me?" James asked eagerly. "If your mama approves," Hank replied, glancing at Catherine. "It involves sharp knives, after all." "Perhaps when you're a bit older," Catherine suggested diplomatically. "But Hank could teach you other things in the meantime." "Like riding horses," James suggested hopefully. "Like riding horses," Hank agreed, pleased by the boys' enthusiasm. Later, after the boys had been tucked into bed with strict instructions to stay there until morning, the adults gathered in the parlor. Harriet produced a bottle of fine brandy, a gift from a grateful customer. "To family," she proposed, raising her glass. "Old and new." They drank the toast, the brandy warming Hank from within. After a comfortable hour of conversation, Harriet excused herself, claiming fatigue but throwing a meaningful glance at her sister as she departed. Left alone, Hank and Catherine sat in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the fire burn low in the grate. "I have something for you," Hank said finally, reaching into his pocket. "Not much, but I wanted you to have it tonight." He handed Catherine a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple string. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a star. "It's beautiful," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate design. "It was my mother's," Hank explained. "One of the few things I have from her. My pa gave it to her on their first Christmas together." Catherine looked up sharply, understanding the significance. "Hank, I can't accept this. It's a family heirloom." "That's why I want you to have it," he said quietly, "because I hope. That is, I've come to think of you and James as my family." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Hank moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "Catherine Winters, I know it hasn't been long, and I know we both carry scars from the past, but I love you, I love your son, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life with you both." A tear slipped down Catherine's cheek. "Are you proposing, Hank Reeves?" "I reckon I am," he admitted with a small smile. "Not very elegantly, but from the heart." "Then my answer is yes," Catherine whispered, leaning forward to press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Hank pulled her closer, his hand cradling the back of her head. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I love you," Catherine said, the words feeling both foreign and completely right on her lips. "I didn't think I'd ever say that to another man after Edward died, but I love you, Hank." Hank's face broke into a smile that transformed his weathered features. "Best Christmas gift I could ask for," he said huskily. They stayed up late, making plans for their future together. Hank would look into land for his horse breeding operation. Catherine would continue working with Harriet until they were established. They would marry in the spring, when the snow melted and the world turned green again. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear. Hank woke to the sound of excited whispers outside his door, followed by a tentative knock. "Mr. Hank," James called. "Are you awake? It's Christmas." "Coming, son," Hank replied, pulling on his clothes quickly downstairs. The parlor had been transformed. Harriet had risen early to stoke the fire and arrange the gifts beneath the small evergreen tree decorated with paper stars and strings of cranberries. Catherine was already there, looking radiant in a red dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Merry Christmas," she greeted him, her eyes conveying much more than the simple phrase. "Merry Christmas," he returned, resisting the urge to kiss her in front of the boys who were bouncing with impatience. "Can we open the presents now?" Thomas begged his mother. "I think that's in order," Harriet agreed with a smile. "James, why don't you and Thomas hand them out?" The boys needed no further encouragement, diving into their task with enthusiasm. Soon everyone had a small pile of gifts before them: new mittens, books, sweets, and more practical items. Hank was touched to receive a hand-knitted scarf from Catherine and a drawing from James showing 3 stick figures labeled Mama, Me, and Mr. Hank standing beside what appeared to be a house. "That's us at our new house," James explained seriously. "When you marry Mama." The room fell silent. Catherine looked mortified. "James, how did you— I heard you and Mr. Hank talking last night," the boy admitted. "I got up for a drink of water." Harriet's eyebrows shot up. "Is there something you two would like to share with the class?" Hank looked at Catherine, who gave him a small nod. "Well," he began, clearing his throat, "I asked Catherine to marry me last night and she said yes." Thomas let out a whoop. "Does that mean you're going to be James's pa now, if he'll have me?" Hank replied, looking at James. The boy considered this for a moment, his face serious. "I'd like that," he said finally, "but I already had a pa and I don't want to forget him." "You never will," Hank assured him, kneeling to the boy's level. "Your pa will always be your pa. But if you'd like, I could be a second pa for you, one who's here to take care of you and your mama and to teach you things, and to love you just as much as your first pa did." James thought about this, then nodded solemnly. "I think that would be okay." "Then it's settled," Harriet declared, wiping a suspicious moisture from her eyes. "We're to have a wedding in the spring. This calls for celebration." She disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a plate of cinnamon rolls she'd been saving for a special occasion. The rest of Christmas Day passed in a blur of happiness. Neighbors dropped by with small gifts and left with news of the engagement. By evening, it seemed the whole town knew that the widow Winters and the cowboy who had rescued her and her son from kidnappers were to be married. "Does it bother you?" Hank asked Catherine as they stood on the porch that night watching the stars. Being the subject of town gossip, Catherine shook her head. "Not when the gossip is that I've found happiness again." She leaned against him and his arm encircled her waist naturally. "Besides, it's a good story, isn't it? Cowboy finds woman searching for her child in a blinding storm and makes her his family," Hank chuckled. "When you put it that way, it does sound like something from a dime novel." "Except it's real," Catherine said softly. "You're real, and what I feel for you is real." Hank turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. "I want you to know something, Catherine. I'll never try to replace what you had with Edward. What we build together will be its own thing, different, but just as true." Catherine reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I know that. Just as I know you're not trying to forget your wife and daughter. We carry them with us, Hank. They're part of who we are," he nodded, throat tight with emotion. "You're a wise woman, Catherine Winters." "Soon to be Catherine Reeves," she reminded him with a smile. "I like the sound of that," Hank murmured, drawing her closer for a kiss. Spring came to Montana in fits and starts, snow melting to reveal tender green shoots, only to be covered again by late squalls. By April, however, the weather had settled enough for outdoor work to begin in earnest. Hank had secured a promising piece of land 3 miles outside Fort Benton, 160 acres, with good water access and natural meadows perfect for grazing horses. With the help of several men from town, he began construction on a modest house and barn, determined to have a home ready for his new family by the time they married in May. Catherine divided her time between the millinery shop, where spring bonnets were in high demand, and preparations for the wedding. James split his days between school and helping Hank with the ranch, returning home each evening dusty but glowing with happiness. "He adores you," Catherine observed one evening as she and Hank sat on Harriet's porch swing watching the sunset. "Sometimes I think he loves you more than me." "Not possible," Hank assured her, "but a boy needs a man to look up to. I'm just grateful he's chosen me." "We both chose you," Catherine reminded him, resting her head on his shoulder. The wedding took place on the first Saturday in May, a perfect spring day with clear skies and wildflowers blooming across the prairie. The ceremony was held in the small church where James had performed in the Christmas pageant, now decorated with white ribbons and early spring blossoms. Catherine wore a gown of pale blue silk, Harriet's wedding gift, with the silver star brooch pinned at her throat. James stood proudly beside Hank, serving as best man despite being only 7 years old, his face solemn with the responsibility. "Do you, Henry James Reeves, take Catherine Elizabeth Winters to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the minister asked. "I do," Hank replied, his voice steady and sure. "And do you, Catherine Elizabeth Winters, take Henry James Reeves to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Catherine smiled up at the tall cowboy who had rescued her from a blizzard and stolen her heart. "I do," she said clearly. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The minister beamed at them. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Reeves." Hank leaned down, his kiss gentle but filled with promise. The congregation broke into applause, led by an enthusiastic James who was practically bouncing with excitement. The reception was held at Harriet's house, spilling into the garden where tables had been set up and decorated with fresh flowers. It seemed the entire town had turned out to celebrate, bringing gifts and well wishes for the new family. "Mrs. Reeves," Hank murmured as they shared their first dance together. "How does it feel?" "Perfect," Catherine replied, looking up at her new husband with shining eyes. "Absolutely perfect." Later, as the celebration continued around them, James tugged at Hank's sleeve. "Can I call you Pa now?" he asked shyly. Hank knelt down, putting himself at eye level with the boy. "I'd be honored if you did, son." James threw his arms around Hank's neck in a fierce hug. "I love you, Pa." Hank's eyes met Catherine's over the boy's shoulder, and he saw her own were damp with happy tears. "I love you too, James," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than you'll ever know." The following day, they moved into their new home on the ranch. It was simple but sturdy, with 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a wide front porch where Catherine immediately placed rocking chairs for summer evenings. "Welcome home," Hank said, carrying her over the threshold as tradition demanded. "Home," Catherine repeated, looking around at the house he had built for them. "It's a good word, isn't it?" "The best," Hank agreed, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "And we'll make it better each day." The years that followed proved him right. The horse breeding operation flourished, with Hank developing a reputation for quality stock that commanded premium prices. Catherine continued to work part-time at the millinery shop, her creations becoming sought after throughout the territory. James grew tall and strong, with Hank's quiet confidence and his mother's quick mind. At 10, he could ride as well as most grown men and had developed a special touch with the more difficult horses, a gift Hank encouraged. Their family expanded too. On a snowy December night, almost 3 years to the day after Hank had found Catherine in the blizzard, she gave birth to a daughter they named Hope. 2 years later, a son followed, whom they called Edward Henry in honor of both Catherine's first husband and Hank himself. Life on the Montana frontier was never easy. There were droughts and harsh winters, illness and hardship. But there was also joy in watching their children grow, in building something lasting together, in the quiet moments between husband and wife when the day's work was done. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Hank surprised Catherine with a special gift, a locket containing miniature portraits of all 3 children, James included. "To remind you of the family we've made," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. Catherine touched the locket, then reached up to caress his face, now weathered by years of working outdoors but still handsome to her eyes. "I don't need reminding," she said softly. "It's written in every moment of our lives together." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching James teach little Edward to throw a lasso while Hope gathered wildflowers nearby, Catherine leaned against her husband's shoulder. "You ever think about that day?" she asked. "The blizzard," Hank nodded, his arm tightening around her. "Often." "How close we came to never meeting." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Makes me believe in fate or providence or whatever you want to call it." "Me too," Catherine admitted, "though I prefer to think of it as love finding a way even through a blinding storm." Hank smiled, watching their children play in the golden light of the setting sun. From disaster and loss had come this life, this family, this love that sustained them through all seasons. A cowboy had found a woman searching for her child in a blinding storm and made her his family, and in doing so, had found his own heart's true home.